Welcome to everybody who's joining. Hopefully the audio is okay. Going to get started in just a couple minutes. Want to let everybody join. See some familiar names joining. Welcome to everybody.
Excellent.
We'll be starting up in just a couple of minutes. I just want to get everybody who signed up in, or nearly as many. Should be about 150 people. I also want to say this is our first webinar, so if there are any technical glitches, please forgive us. We will get better. Kind of awkward just sitting here, so looks like about half or so have joined. So I'm going to start just giving everybody an idea of what the layout of this will be. We're going to start. I'm going to introduce the company, a little bit about what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve with this. Then secondly, Dr. Lake will give his chat for about 15 minutes. We're going to really work hard to contain him. If anybody here knows Jason, it can be challenging to limit. He's got a lot to say, which is what makes him so great. But at the same time, in the interest of time and you know, everybody, it's middle of the day, et cetera, here on the East Coast at least, I want to be respectful of that. But what we're going to do once Dr. Lake finishes up, we are going to have a quick 10, 15, 20, whatever it takes, Q&A session. So anybody who wants to send in some questions, specifics, et cetera, we'll be able to get a little bit more in detail, hopefully on some specifics that people are curious about. In addition, anybody is always welcome to email me directly. Should have my email address. It's ben@hawkindynamics.com. Always happy to talk about this stuff and answer any questions, technical, et cetera. We're also planning our April clinic in St. Louis. That's going to be just about a month, little under a month from today. All things, we're assuming it's still on given the pandemic. However, we are working on alternative arrangements if in fact we cannot hold it at the university. So we'll be providing more information on that in the next 2 weeks. Some schools are obviously limiting access to campus, so not fun for anybody. All right, so we have about half the people have shown up. Again, I just want to give us a couple minutes to let people arrive, get oriented, and then I'll kind of give my official little chat about what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve, and then introduce Dr. Lake, who will not be on video, I'm told.
No. Why would anyone want that? Not even my mum would want that.
Yeah. Couple more minutes. Quite a few names I recognize are here. Quite a few users. That's great. That's exciting. Okay. All right, we're just going to give it, I think, until 11:40 or so, so another 5 minutes. I just want to let people show up. You know, they might be having issues with Zoom or something like that. But again, I'm going to reiterate this. This is our first time doing this, so please have mercy on us if anything doesn't go smoothly. I'm not too worried about Dr. Lake, more worried about the technical side of things and myself. But Jason does this basically every day, so not all that challenging for him.
No, but it's still super cool.
All right. More people, come on. I don't know if people are having any technical issues with the Zoom platform. Also, just a note, this is being recorded. Everything will be available after, with hopefully minimal editing required, but we want to make this information freely available to anybody who wants to get it. So something to keep in mind, if you can't stick around, you will be able to review later on. In addition, we will be holding hopefully weekly, if not every other week, webinars down the road. So next week, we had planned to have Drake from a university in the Midwest. However, he was not allowed to do it from his university, which is totally understandable. So in lieu of that, we are going to likely be holding just an online live demo of our system and then doing a question and answer session about force plates, force testing in general. We're probably going to cover things like best practices for testing, give some details on how we do things and why we do them the way we do them. It's just good opportunity. If anybody wants to see the system in action, easy way to do it without having to, commit to a one-on-one demo. But at the same time, if anybody wants to spend a little while going through the system with me or one of our team, we can always do that. We're always happy to do that. You can sign up on our website. You can schedule a demo right on the main homepage. Pretty simple. All right, so 3 more minutes and then we're gonna just launch into it. Again, this is going to be recorded. So if any of your friends, colleagues, etc., want to see what we've got to say, couldn't make it today, we will be disseminating the link to the recording once we're done today. Hope the audio is okay. If anybody has any suggestions how we can do things better, we're always open to that as well. And all right, numbers are rising. There's Victor. All right. Yeah, so this is our first time using Zoom for webinars. So there's a lot of features that I literally am completely clueless on and haven't taken the time to learn yet. Like to do things on the fly. But yeah, I think we're gonna jump into it in just a second. Thanks, Victor.
Like he was expecting something else, like it wouldn't look good.
Yeah, I hope my diet is paying off, right? All right. Losing a couple pounds is the easiest way to increase your jump height. I can tell you that right now. All right, we're at 56. Well, it's about a third of who signed up. So hopefully people are joining up. We have a Q&A. Oh, hi, Daniel. Yeah, so there is a little Q&A box. Oh, that's fine. So Teddy, double sign up. That's fine. We're not going to spam. By the way, if you sign up for one of our webinars, we're not going to spam you with our newsletters and things like that. Try to be respectful of the fact that you probably get enough newsletters from various companies, and we're really doing this as a means of just trying to get more information out there in the market. We really think that this information shouldn't be behind a locked door. It's really basic stuff, and we believe firmly that the more people you get acquainted and educated on this stuff, the better it is for everybody. So regardless of whether you use our force plates or another company, we don't hold that against you for sure. And don't feel like you can't ask questions. We really do want to help. We're really trying to do this to just to, educate the market. I think what we found over the last few years of since we started this company is that everybody wants to use force plates, really likes the idea of using force plates. Oh, nice. Brazilian. Nice. Welcome from Brazil. Awesome. I hope everybody is doing well and healthy everywhere, obviously. Yeah, so as I was saying, we're really trying to get more information out there for folks who are interested in this stuff. It's really quite cool, but one of the things that we always have heard as feedback, and one thing we've seen continuously since starting the company, is that there aren't many great sources for, I don't want to say dumbed down, but I want to say simplified information about force data. A lot of people like to talk about it. There's a lot of interesting conversations, debates, whatever, on the internet, on Twitter especially, which is great. We always like that. However, we want to sort of try to become more of a resource for coaches across the industry, for physical therapists, et cetera, who are interested in potentially utilizing this technology, but maybe aren't comfortable with the information that they get out of a force plate or out of the software, et cetera. So this is not a sales pitch. We're not trying to sell you our product if you aren't already a customer. I mean, if you want to buy force plates, please let me know. But that's not the point of this educational series that we're doing. So Dr. Lake has been doing a couple of blog posts, regular weekly blog posts. That's going to continue. Everything's fairly surface level. Just trying to give people a little more confidence in looking at the information, and also reminding everybody across the board that don't overcomplicate this stuff. Force plates can be extremely useful. One of the things I really like that Dr. Lake puts in his blogs, and obviously he's going to say today, because we've talked about it, you don't necessarily need a force plate. There are lots of ways to get good data on athletes. You may not have the budget, you may not have the space, you may not have the time, et cetera. But if you're interested in force plates, it's a really great tool. I think it can get confounded a little bit where, obviously my business is in selling force plates. So I think everybody needs a force plate, but at the end of the day, I recognize that not everybody has the budget, not everybody has the time, et cetera. Not everybody has the means to do it. And so there are other tools out there that can be a great place to start. So I'm going to give a little bit about our company and then hand it off to Jason now, since we're at a little past 11:40. So I'm Ben Watson. I'm the CEO of Talkin Dynamics. Started the company just about 3 years ago. In its current form, we've been around for 2 years. We're based in Westbrook, Maine. It's right outside of Portland, northeast of America, old New England. We have a fairly large office, about 10 employees. We're growing very rapidly. And as I've said repeatedly, we really believe in force data and its ability to help coaches better train their athletes, better understand their athletes, and also help better communicate with and about their athletes. Yeah, we've been doing really well. We're really excited. We have a lot of growth potential. We're really trying to get more and more people comfortable with the information you can get from a force plate. And our whole mantra is about transparency, ease of use. We're also really trying hard to build a community around our technology and around this information. I think that's something that everybody understands in the age of social media. We love when our users share information, they ask questions on social media, they email us questions. That's really important to what we're trying to do. We built the system purely off of user feedback. I think a lot of companies like to say that, but in our case, we really do listen. So if you have input, you have ideas, you have questions, we really do want to hear them. Moving on, I'm going to hand things off to Dr. Lake. He's going to walk through a quick presentation. Then we'll do a question and answer session. And again, we're holding another webinar next week, likely a little bit later in the day. We still have to kind of play around with what time works best for the audience, because we do have a lot of people from Europe as well. But yeah, we want to hear your questions. If you have ideas, things you'd like us to discuss, we'd love for you to send us some ideas in. We're also going to be streaming these on YouTube in the future, but of course, like YouTube made me activate our account and some, I don't get it. But we couldn't do it today. So next week, our webinar will be broadcast on YouTube as well. We're looking forward to it. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and please don't hesitate to engage and ask questions. I'm going to hand it off to Jason now, or Dr. Lake, I should say. So you are going to not see me for a little while, thankfully. All right. All right, so Jason, you have the floor.
Okay, can you see what I am showing you? Okay, there we go. So, how exciting is this? Blimey, somebody gives me 10 to 15 minutes to talk about force plates. That
Jason,
is
I can't see.
fantastic. What can't you see?
Can't see anything.
Oh my God. Right, here we go. Let's bear with me a second.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Yeah, we definitely can't see it.
Okay. Here we go.
We did this yesterday and it worked. So.
Got it?
Yeah.
There we are. Right. Start again. So, yeah, 10 to 15 minutes to talk about force plates. How exciting. All I really want to do today is to just provide a brief overview of some of the basic theory that underpins using this kind of technology and some of the information that you can get from it. So obviously you can then make your own decisions about whether this sort of thing could be for you, or how you could perhaps, if you're an existing force plate user, how you could perhaps improve practice. And so really what I'd like to focus on is a couple of basic definitions, because I think one of the key things that's really missing out there, and I think Ben touched on this earlier on, is that there is not an awful lot of educational resources out there for this kind of thing. And the thing is, it's so simple. It often seems completely overwhelming, but it is actually so simple that I think we need to make more use of it if we possibly can. And so let's kick off with a basic definition first. And of course, probably not going to surprise you to learn that we want to talk about what is force. I would say that the simplest definition I've ever come across is by Roger Bartlett in one of his biomechanics textbooks. And essentially he describes it as a force as a pushing or pulling action that one object exerts on another. So essentially, if you push or pull against something, whether that's the ground, yourself, an opponent, or a sporting implement, you're applying force. And obviously you're achieving that by contracting your muscles in some sort of combination, typically based around some sort of sporting technique. The force plate is probably the simplest tool we have in the sports biomechanics arsenal, believe it or not. Now, biomechanics tends to get quite a bad rap, and I completely get it. It's a very technical sort of discipline, especially when you start drifting down the road of using 3D motion capture and surface EMG, for example. But force plates themselves, once they're actually set up, and if that's in a lab, they're typically bolted into the ground, or if it's in a portable system, there's normally a walkthrough guide to take you through how to set them up. All you really need to do is actually figure out the testing protocol and then press go. And then the data's collected. And what it will do then is essentially give you some really useful data potentially. And so
Those are your feet.
they are my feet. Sorry, yeah. No, they're really not my feet. They're really not my feet. As soon as I clicked on it, I thought, oh, that's a bit grim, isn't it? Anyway,
that is brutal.
they are Pete Mundy's feet. His hobbit feet. He doesn't know I've used this photo, so please don't tell him. So basically, the force plate is essentially a really sensitive bathroom scale. And we know that if we stand on the bathroom scale, whether at home or in a lab or whatever, if we stand still, we'll get typically what we refer to as our body weight or body mass in either kilograms or pounds or whatever. Okay, we know then that if we stand still, we're going to get that relatively static number. However, if we start to move, i.e. we jiggle about a little bit, the number will move with us. And this is essentially down to how we're interacting with the ground. So when we stand still, just by standing still, we're exerting force against the ground, and that ground is then pushing up against us. And that's essentially the basis on which force platforms work. Here, yeah, let's go back to the manky feet. Oof, that is grim, isn't it? So from this horrible example to the sort of product that Hawkin Dynamics sell, which is a really beautiful bit of kit, really streamlined.
It's mildly distorted image, Jason.
It is, but deal with it.
They're not that tall.
No, exactly. Well, no, but it's a very cool bit of kit. More importantly, though, if I just take you to the underneath of the system, the force platform itself, like I say, is a really sort of basically a bar from scale. What distinguishes it, however, is we have strain gauges in each of these four corners. And it's these strain gauges that enable us to, where are we? So these strain gauges in each corner that essentially deform as you apply load to it. So you stand on it, those strain gauges will deform, and that will give you a recording of your weight. And that's really cool. And of course, as you then try to move around, you'll then change the pattern of force that you're applying to the ground or applying to the force plates, which is really cool. What that then means is that if you understand some of the basic theory that underpins force analysis, you can get an awful lot of information by just standing on a force plate and then moving, and performing some simple movements. And we tend to get that by studying and deconstructing the force time curve. And so let me just play this video for you. So if you watch this here, what we've got is our guy on the left here, standing on a force plate, and simultaneously this high-speed video footage recording his performance. And all he's going to do is perform a bodyweight squat. And you can see initially, as he's standing still, the force plate is acting like the bar from scale. So it's just displaying his weight, which is around 800 newtons, or around sort of 78, 79 kilograms, if you convert it to SI units. And what you'll see is, and this is what I find really useful for people to understand, is that at this particular point in time, look, our force has an initial decrease, but then, and while our athlete is still squatting down, starts to increase, continues to increase until it gets to a peak, after which our athlete then starts to reverse that downward movement and pushes against the ground to stand himself back up. And so this I find really useful, because what it's essentially showing us is that the force time curve isn't always as intuitive as perhaps we think it is. And what I mean by that is, this doesn't necessarily mean that our jumper is moving down, our squatter is moving downwards. Likewise, an increase in force doesn't necessarily mean that our squatter is moving upwards. So what we have to understand is that what this force time curve shows us is essentially a reflection of the acceleration of our athlete. So whether his movement is speeding up or slowing down. And it also gives us an indication of the direction he's moving in. And I'll take you through that in a bit more detail in a moment. That's a relatively simple movement. So if you can get your head around or start understanding the interaction between the movement that athletes performing and the shape of the force time curve, that can be really useful. And then if we move on to a slightly more complicated movement, we have this guy here performing a counter movement jump, which many of you either will do or probably have used in the past or perhaps performed. Again, what you can see down here is at the moment, the force plate is acting like a bar from scale. It's giving us our jumper's weight. Now, this is really nice because the slow motion enables us to see that as the hips, knees, and ankles start to flex, and as our athlete is accelerating towards the ground without applying any concentric or eccentric forces, he weighs less for this period of time. Then, as he starts to retard his downward movement, you can see that that force increases. So we've got some positive acceleration, but the movement direction is still negative. Then as we get to this point here, we get a little bump in the force time curve as he swings his arms, and he gradually becomes less and less heavy. So he essentially unweights as he eventually leaves the ground at this point here. We can see he's in flight now, got a pretty decent jump on him. And then the end of the jump will be marked by a really sharp increase in force as first the toes hit the ground and then the heel, and so all of his weight lands on that force platform. And this simple test, and it really is simple, gives us an opportunity to actually get a much better understanding of what our athlete or what your athletes are able to do in terms of their neuromuscular capacity. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean with that in a moment. But essentially, what we ideally want to try and do is to take a force time curve that looks like this, deconstruct it like this. I mean, come on, who doesn't get excited when they see something like this? All we've done here, though, is we've used, I mean, I'm excited. So all I've done here is I've used Newton's laws of motion. So I mean, we all know the force equals mass times acceleration, and I'm going to touch on that in a moment, but we can use that relationship to start getting more information from our force time data. So what I've done is I've done some relatively simple calculations here, and you can see that the red curve, the red squiggly line, is our force data from a counter movement jump like the one you've just seen. And the yellow line, the yellow squiggly line, is our velocity data. So how quickly our jumper is moving and the direction that they're moving in. So we can use this to deconstruct that force time curve. So you can see that A is essentially where the jump starts. Between points A and B, we've got a negative acceleration, and we know it's a negative acceleration because the velocity is decreasing. We also know that the jumper is moving in a negative direction, and we know this because the velocity data here is below 0, okay? Between B and C, this is essentially where the jumper starts to put on the brakes. Now, there's been some great research recently by some guys, John Harry and his colleagues, who have shown that actually part of the eccentric phase may actually start here. But traditionally, we'll associate B as the start of what we typically call the eccentric phase. And that might be a little bit misleading, but it's kind of good from a general perspective. And what we see here is that essentially the athlete's putting on the brakes, they're starting to speed up. So we've got a positive acceleration, okay, because it's an increase in that velocity time curve, but we're still moving in a negative direction. C marks that lowest squat position. So it's at this point here, this is our transition from down to upward movement. So again, we've got positive acceleration because the slope of the velocity time curve is increasing. But now we know that because it's above 0, we have got a positive direction as well. So that jumper is now pushing against the ground and moving to this point here, point E, where he leaves the ground. We then have a brief period between D and E where we've still got some positive movement. The jumper is still moving upwards before he leaves the ground, but we got some negative acceleration as we see the slope of the velocity time curve starts to decrease. And that's pretty much forms the basis of any kind of analysis that we might want to do. Because from this, we can calculate all sorts of different types of variables. We can calculate it for the whole of the contact phase from A to E, or we can calculate it for the unweighting, the braking eccentric phase, the propulsion phase, or indeed all of the concentric phase. And I'll go on to a little bit more detail in a moment about how you might want to, or how you can most effectively start thinking about what variables you might want to look at. But that's really straightforward. And we do all of this using these. And I won't dwell on this too much, but anybody who's followed my Twitter account will have probably seen it up there at some point. And you can always get in touch with me and email me or get hold of me via Twitter, and I'm more than happy to pass this on. This is a relatively I'm going to say idiot proof. The reason I say idiot proof is because I've developed it for my first year sports science students. And I think most of them get it. Now, that isn't meant to sound as patronizing as it probably did. But what I mean is that actually, if you're look, every object, whether it's an individual or a sporting implement, will have inertia. If it's moving, okay, then it's defined by its mass. Sorry, if it's not moving, it's defined by its mass, but if it's moving, it's defined by its momentum. And we know that momentum is directly proportional to the impulse that we apply. And all the impulse is force multiplied by the change in time. So how hard you push or pull something and how long you push or pull it for. And they're two really useful qualities, three if you include the velocity component of of momentum, three really useful elements for assessing someone's neuromuscular capacity. Okay. The harder you push, the longer you push for, the greater your impulse will be. And as a consequence, the faster you'll move. But of course, most sports are typically constrained by time. So we ideally want our athletes to be able to apply as much force as they possibly can in as short a period as they possibly can, so they're moving as fast as they can, whether that's to actually evade an opposition player or whatever. Very, very rarely are your athletes afforded the opportunity to take as long as they possibly can to apply force. So impulse for me is a really important metric. Excuse me. Any area but around the force time curve, so here, for example, or here, the area under the force time curve, that's the impulse. It's how hard the athlete is pushed against the ground in this case and how long they've pushed or pulled for. Okay. So what we can probably do then is start thinking of impulse as the effort we apply or the effort we're exerting and the time we exert it over. And that will be directly proportional to how quickly and the direction that we'll move in. All right. So impulse, momentum, really, really simple stuff. It's often lost though, and for some reason, strength and conditioning practitioners particularly seem hell-bent on absolutely overwhelming themselves and overcomplicating this. The bottom line is, if you push or pull something for a certain amount of time and it's sufficient to overcome that object's inertia, it will move. The greater the impulse you apply against it, the harder you push or pull, and the longer you push or pull against an object, the faster it will move, okay? Simple as that. And like I said earlier, ideally, this probably isn't going to be the strategy we're going to be encouraging our athletes to use. It's probably going to be this down here. We want to get them to the point where they can transmit as much force as they possibly can and apply as much force as they possibly can in the shortest possible time period. So let's think about some influencing factors. Just the last couple of slides to finish off and hopefully get you thinking a bit. Ideally, if you're already using force plates or you're seriously considering using them, start thinking about what metrics you can use. Most importantly though, think about why are you going to use them? What do they actually tell you? Do you understand what that metric represents? And how can you use that to inform your day-to-day practice? Part of that practice should be developing or building a robust athlete model to try and gauge what they're currently able to do and where perhaps you need them to get to. So you can figure out that plan of attack to get them from point A to point B. And in the back of your mind, you should always have why. Why am I doing this? Make sure, regardless of your level of understanding, make sure that you own your data. And there's nothing wrong with starting right at the bottom and thinking, okay, so I understand this concept. That's what I'm going to stick with from now. And then start building on that as you attend more of these webinars or come to see us speak or read journal articles or whatever. Whatever you can do to improve your understanding of this area, use it to take ownership of your data. You're responsible for it. Okay, so any decisions that you make, you should be happy and comfortable with your understanding underpinning those decisions. And so I like to try it now. I kind of stole the skeleton of this idea from John McMahon. And if anybody knows John McMahon, he's a really good guy, really bright guy, doesn't mind sharing his knowledge, and he puts this stuff really, really easily. Now, essentially, we want to report at least one kind of output metric, and these might include something like jump height, takeoff velocity, or jump momentum, where jump momentum is simply the athlete's body mass multiplied by how quickly they're moving at takeoff. One or two driver metrics, ideally, I would suggest. And what I mean by driver metrics are the kind of things that drive that performance. So typically, we're using a force plate, so let's start thinking about forces. Maybe the average force that's applied during the braking or propulsion phase. Maybe the force at the lowest displacement, so that marks that force as that transition from down to up. Try and support any driver metrics you use with strategy metrics. And what I mean by these are, essentially, these gives us an insight into what strategy the jumper uses to get or to perform that particular type of movement. It doesn't necessarily mean to be need to be intentional, but things like the braking time, propulsion time, or the total movement time. Indeed, we might start thinking about things like how far did the jumper squat down? Was it more than normal? Was it faster than normal? Okay, if the down displacement increases but the braking time decreases, then we know that the downward velocity has increased. So as a consequence, that negative impulse has increased. And so that will probably make them bouncier. And so they'll probably be able to jump much higher. Now, please take this in the spirit it's meant. But the final metrics we want to sort of consider are things like the fluffy metrics. These are the metrics that seem to be all over social media. Okay, they can be incredibly useful. Note, can be. You have a robust rationale for why you're using them. So you understand what they represent, you understand how they've been calculated, and you know what they're bringing to the table. Okay, because variables like mean power, for example, isn't going to mean an awful lot if you're testing your athlete pre to post training intervention if they completely change their strategy. So there's no point in considering mean power if you don't consider some sort of strategy metric as well. So you've got to use a combination of these to tell the story. There is no magic bullet. Anybody who tells you there is a magic bullet is lying to you. Okay, trust me. Why would you trust me? You don't even know me, do you? If you saw me, you'd see I've got a trusting face. Finally, from me. Finally, from me. Data ownership is so important. Like Ben said before, do you need a force platform to be a successful Western Sea coach? Or, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Can they be incredibly useful? Oh God, yes, they can. However, you should only invest your time and energy and finance into owning a pair of force plates if you understand why you're going to use them. If you don't, any test you get your athletes to do on them is essentially unethical. You should not be getting your athletes to spend time and energy on a test if it's not going to give you anything, and you're responsible for that. So please take ownership of your data. And always remember, standardize, collect, avoid black boxes, and decipher and observe, and use this information to guide your practice. Bugger, I went to 20 minutes. Sorry, Ben.
As expected, well over the time. So anybody who has some questions, now would be the time to ask. We can then answer them in real time. I'm going to queue up 1 second here. We're going to hang around for a few minutes. There's no rush. We don't have a hard stop at 12:30 or anything. Hopefully we'll answer any questions by then, but this is obviously going to be available as well for download later on. Give me 1 second here. I'm supposed to start my video. Oh, okay. So Jason, can you switch back to making me the host?
Yeah, if I knew how to do that, I'd be dangerous, wouldn't I? There you go. Should have it now. Got it back?
Not yet. Yeah. So as I mentioned, please forgive any technical glitches. This is what I'm talking about. Jason, on your panelist thing, you should be able to switch. This is the second time we've used this, so.
No, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Sorry. Oh, it does say you're still the host, actually.
It does?
Yeah.
Well.
That means it's not my fault.
All right. Well, I'm just going to, I guess, leave it the way it is without showing my video. Okay, so we have a question here from Joe Club. Thank you, Dr. Lake. You mentioned the importance of impulse. What metric do you like to use to represent this? As mentioned, increasing time. Yep, but probably not the outcome we want. Yeah, so what is the simplest or best metric to use to show a positive change?
I would say that there's a couple of different ways of looking at it, but I think if you're looking at jump height, and there's nothing wrong with looking at jump height, it's certainly not perfect, and there's some great work coming out recently that's shown why it's not perfect. But if you show that there is a difference in jump height, great, then you know that something's changed. And what you can then do is dig down into the mechanisms that underpin that. So start thinking about things like the impulse. So is it an increase in the force? Is it a decrease in the time? Or is it a combination of those things? So it's entirely possible to increase jump height by applying less force over greater time. And obviously that's probably not going to be ideal. So start thinking about, okay, what is the change I want to try and elicit? Or what is the potential change as a consequence of competition injury or training? So start thinking about how hard that athlete can push over a particular phase of interest and how long it's taking them. If either of those are changing, then you can start to figure out whether they're changing positively or not, and obviously act accordingly.
Yeah, what I think the key there is, unfortunately, there is no single metric that we can then say, okay, this is going up, therefore our programming is working, is having the intended effect. The thing that we often talk about with users is taking multiple metrics in at the same time, even if it's just 3 or 4 at a total. If jump height is increasing, the output metric, what factors went into that, right? So
definitely. I think the other thing to bear in mind, though, is that jump height might not increase. However, if you then dig down into the impulse, your athlete might be applying the same impulse by applying at much larger forces over a much shorter time.
Totally.
And I would still argue that that's a positive change.
Totally. Oh, nice. Former student has a question. I also have one here. What would you recommend as a monitoring strategy for your influencing factors, trends, relationships? Yeah, that's a loaded question. How are you going to analyze it, essentially?
Let me just walk straight into that.
Standard.
With both eyes shut. No, look, I think anybody who tries to tell you that there's only one strategy that you should use or can use is fibbing. And I think without trying to evade the question too hard, it's essentially you have to think about what's of interest to you at that particular point in time. What's the thing that might be changing, and why might it be changing? So start thinking about what it is. So I think you definitely, like Ben said, we definitely have to look at least 3 or 4 variables. Some sort of output variable, yeah, fine. But you don't even necessarily have to look at one of those, but certainly you need to look at some of the driver variables and some of the strategy variables. So you need to be looking at how hard the athlete's pushing or pulling, and looking at the time component of that.
And then
Ultimately,
also
they're key.
And also tracking that over a period of time, right? So
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry.
So
yeah,
any
yeah.
of these measures, the key is that you need some methodology for monitoring the change over time, and some softwares have that built in. Some systems also are working on flagging, so is setting a threshold, i.e., half standard deviation, positive or minus, plus or minus, I should say, indicates that, okay, there is a significant change and can automatically highlight that. It looks like there's a couple of additional questions, same thing, both asking about flight time or takeoff velocity, which is a great one. So if you have a force plate, you should not be using flight time for jump height, period. It's not the best way to calculate it. You might as well have a jump mat. If you're using flight time, which obviously is, very, very simple methodology for calculating jump height from flight time, you should never be looking at that if you have a force plate, period. Yeah, not even close.
No, absolutely.
No question. That is an yes or true or false. Unless, and we don't want to get too into the weeds on this, but unless you're doing multiple jumps in a row, what we always see, and so one of the things that we offer users is they'll say, hey, we've been using, system X, Y, or Z for this much time. We have all this data. Can we import it into our software? We just did this literally yesterday. And what we found was that there was a lot of data that was like 4 or 5 jumps in a row. So over a 25-second recording, it's hard for the athlete to stabilize. If they cannot stabilize in between jumps, the end result is you get a lot of movement when you need no movement. You really do need a good quiet phase. This is something I'm going to cover pretty extensively next week in our webinar on best practices in using our system and just testing in general. But if drift is a real thing, and if the athlete, so this says any calculation assumes the athlete is not moving when we begin the integration. So we start calculating acceleration continuously, and then we take that, we use that to get velocity, continuous velocity, and we get basically a velocity curve, which is what Dr. Lake showed overlaid on the force curve. If somebody is not, if somebody is moving when the system thinks they are not moving, the end result is you get an inflated takeoff velocity, and that you will greatly overestimate jump height if you're using takeoff velocity. So a couple ideas, you could either, like what we do in our multi-rebound protocol, is we just use flight time. It's basically an running RSI test. However, if it's just a counter movement jump, those are bad jumps. There's no way to fake that, right? Integration, you're going to screw it up. So Chris, our one of our developers, reminded me to mention the multi-rebound, because that is a case we can account for drift. It's also something Jason can talk a little bit about, but drift is a real thing when you're running this math on the data. Okay, a couple of different questions. Pragmatically applying truly standardized testing is a difficult conundrum. How do you feel about incorporating force plate data collection as part of a training? Yeah, I like that a lot.
Definitely.
From Adam. Oh gosh, there's a lot. Yeah, so I think that's really where we're headed. I can answer this one for Adam. I hope competently. We're really heading in the direction of, and just internally, what we're trying to do as a company is we really are trying to make force testing easy enough that it can be incorporated into the training program. That is not as easy as it might sound. There are things like workflow. There are things like, proper I guess training, which lands on our feet, right? So something we really work hard on is ensuring that we're training our users, things like user guides, etc. Um, but yes, I think that will be useful in the future to basically kind of try to seamlessly integrate the testing into the training. But it's always a work in progress. All the limitation is really the technology and people. But Adam, that's a great question. I think we have seen teams, we have users right now in the States at least who test pre-game. They test at the same time every time they test. It's really important if you want to really develop a standardized protocol. So they test pre-game. They may in fact also test post-game. I'm not sure. However, they bring the plates with them. So it's a portable, our system is portable, which, most of the reasonably affordable ones are. People take it with them, test consistently at the same time. In this case, it's a basketball team. They test on the basketball court, which we think is obviously very cool, but it's also very useful because if they see pre-game, hey, this athlete is maybe displaying a higher asymmetry than normal. Maybe they're not as quick as normal. It might play into their minutes in that particular game, et cetera. I don't know that everybody's that progressive, but I think that is in a perfect world where things are heading. I don't know if Tom's question is one we really want to get into. I don't know that I personally can't speak on any other products, and I definitely wouldn't use this forum to do that. I would ask Jason privately. He would know better than I, but yeah, we definitely, I think one of the issues that we see in the market, and it's not with any particular company, it's with most companies, is that they do not tell you how they calculate things, right? So something that's very important is this initiation idea, right? There's initiation threshold. We use a couple of different papers that I'm happy to share with anybody that basically make it very simple as to how to calculate, when does the movement truly begin, right? So in any force time curve, or I should say, for a standardized test for a jump, we want to get a nice quiet phase. Ideally, it's 1 second. Sorry, I'm reading all the questions I should be just answering, but we just want to get a good solid quiet phase, and then at some point the athlete begins the movement, right? And so how we define that mathematically is really, really important to how accurate our calculations are going to be. The way we use 5 standard deviations of the quiet phase. So the quiet phase is the first 1 second of a test. And the way our system works, and this is just how our software operates, but it basically beeps when it's time to go. So you hit the start button, the test begins, and it beeps once we've got that quiet phase 1 second. And then the athlete can begin the movement. And as soon as they break that threshold on the counter movement jump in the negative direction, which is 5 times the standard deviation, if they're holding really, really quiet for that 1 second, a single standard deviation is only going to be a few newtons. So it's going to happen pretty quickly once they begin the movement. Then we do like a whole backward search thing. My point being here in going through all this is not to confuse everybody and make it sound more complicated than it is, but it's simply to say, if you want to know how things are calculated, please ask us. We do not hide behind proprietary algorithm nonsense. None of that is true. The way we do things is very simple. I can explain it, I can send it over, and you can test it. With our system, you can export raw data and see how that matches up with, for example, a calculation in Excel.
We have some images to help illustrate that as well.
Totally. So that's a great question in terms of initiation of movement. But I think on multi-jumps, you will find it's very hard to get that consistency from test to test. If you just hit play, record for 50 seconds, for a minute, which you can do with our system fine, if you start to trace that velocity, if you don't have some methodology for correcting that, and you don't have the athlete actually holding between tests, you're going to get really sketchy data. Okay, so next one I see is from Idabo over in Germany, who is a former
Another student.
Yeah. Always educational and entertaining. Is your hesitance towards fluffy metric reserved for counter movement jump and jump testing? Or should I be careful in general using such metrics? And yes, you do have a trusting face. That's a great question.
Thank you very much. I do think you should be careful, but I only urge it not. I have to be careful what I say here because sometimes things come out of my mouth, as you well know, before I actually think them through. Um, I think the key thing I would say is that it absolutely depends on your understanding of A, what that metric is, B, how the metric's calculated, and C, what you think it can reflect in terms of the effect of training, competition, or injury. And that's not me trying to deliberately evade the question. It's more a case of I think you have to take ownership of it. Now, you can take ownership by talking to guys like Ben and myself, Pete Mundy, John McMahon, and loads of other guys out there who are really good on this sort of stuff. Many far better than me. And I think if you listen to them, what they'll tell you is that unless you understand what something represents, there is no point in using it. You must be able to defend it, and ideally, you should always be able to answer the "so what" question. I hope that helps.
I think sometimes, Jason's getting at what he mentioned earlier is we have a tendency to try to overcomplicate things because we think they should be
Absolutely.
complicated. It's like almost like, hey, it's not worth doing if it's not technically confusing. We obviously don't believe in that. I think it's a tendency. I don't think it's unique
Mhm.
to S&C. We see it in business and in
Oh
whatever.
yeah,
It's
absolutely, yeah.
common. It's human nature. But I think really the question that Jason posed is, why are you doing this? Can you come up with a simple explanation for this? Sometimes people ask us like, oh, what do you do? What does your company do? And if I can't answer that in 15, 20 seconds in plain English, then, what do we do? Right. So,
What's the point of doing it? Yeah.
right. Exactly. So I think that's really interesting. And it's a great question. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do with this educational stuff that we're releasing is really kind of hammer some of that stuff out to say, here are the values that we think are a good place to get started. Not telling you exactly how to do it. However, this might be useful. This is what the research says. Here, cite some papers and explain. We're really trying to take a lot of the information that's out there, simplify it, and put it into quote unquote plain English. I think that is really challenging to do, but it can be really valuable. Okay, wow. I see a couple of, what would you recommend? Okay, good. We answered that one. Tommy, do you have your question? I don't think it fully went through. It just says, hi, Dr. Lake, which, that could be it. Michael, how consistent are two curves to one another by the same individual? Okay, so how consistent are force traces for the same person if you're testing 3 to 5 jumps? I can partially answer that. I would just say, it depends on the individual. If you're working with younger athletes, they're typically figuring out different strategies, different ways of improving their jumping, and they're also growing, right? So you might see more variance from test to test, from jump to jump, I should say. With older athletes or athletes who, and by older I mean like 19 and above, like myself, 19, and you might see more you should see some consistency, but again, it also depends on their health. If you're testing at the same time every time you test them, we test here internally all the time, and really we do see a lot of everybody has their pattern more or less after a certain amount of data has been collected. And obviously our software allows us to look at that, to really look at that over time and to see if certain things are changing over time more than others. But just looking at the shape of the curve, most people will jump the same way once they sort of get comfortable and acquainted with their strategy. Jason, I don't know if you want to, you can also look at factors like, are you hands on hips every time? Are you arm swing? There's Lauren Green, who was here. I'm not sure if he's still on the meeting, but Lauren did an amazing social media post that just hit it out of the park, essentially showing the difference of a hands on hips versus arm swing, right? So the difference is pretty stark, and it's related to that momentum thing Jason was talking about, right? So if the arms are involved in the momentum, well, we're going to see a very different sort of plateau propulsive phase, especially because you kind of have well, I'm not going to say you kind of, you have two segments going up.
Yeah. But also the unimodal and bimodal force time curve, so whether it has a single peak or a double peak, can be quite misleading as well. And I think historically we've tried to perhaps read a little bit too much into what the shape suggests. So I think we have to get used to, or we have to start to understand individuals' force time curves. And also, variability isn't a bad thing. If anything, it's actually a positive thing, because it suggests that the athlete has the potential or has the capacity to alter their strategy as and when it's needed. So from a sports performance perspective, that's important.
Awesome. Okay, next question. I want to try to get through the rest of them as quickly as possible, just because we've gone way over our time. Okay, so filtering, that's a great question. You should know those things. You should know a couple things standardized. What is the data collection frequency? So how many samples per second does your system collect? Standard would be 1000 hertz. There's some good research on that. Jason loves to talk about that. The question is, can we talk about filtering? Thanks, Chris. Filtering the data. So if I take a force plate unfiltered, and Jason, if you properly made me the host again, I would be able to
if
show
I knew
this.
How to do that, I'd be dangerous.
Yeah, so I could actually show this, because the filtering does have a significant impact on things like noise. But every force plate, I would say for the most part, unless it's kind of a do-it-yourself, has some electrical filter on it. It should, at least. But we've done a lot of internal studies, basically looking at output metrics and results with and without a filter. And depending on your sensors, depending on your electronics inside of your force plate, if you do have like lower end hardware, yes, you might see a significant difference with a filter. Jason, you want to add anything on filtering?
I would say it definitely depends on the system you're using.
Yeah.
If it's an in-ground force plate, so it's bolted into a big slab of concrete, you're probably, for vertical jumping, not going to need to filter your data. And there is some research that suggests you probably shouldn't. However, that's only that one study that's shown that. So I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis, like everything. So again, it's the default answer. It depends. If the force plate is something, is a Kistler or an AMTI or a Vertex that's bolted to the concrete block in your lab, for example, or wherever it's housed, it's not going to vibrate as much as a portable force plate. So the vibration you get from by their very nature, portable force platforms aren't going to be as sturdy and rigid as their in-ground counterparts. So you're going to get some vibration, and that's where you need to start thinking about the signal noise and perhaps potentially filtering some of that out.
Yep.
Then you have to understand what filtering process you're using, why you're using it, and what difference it makes. And again, that's why people like Ben, myself, Pete Mundy, and John McMahon, and many others can help walk you through that sort of process.
Yeah, I think in general, I wouldn't get too concerned about the filtering thing. We hear that a lot, and I can literally just show it, because we can set the filter on our hardware very easily. It mostly has an impact, at least on our hardware, in terms of just basically the noise levels. One thing I would say is larger force plates tend to have higher noise.
Yeah, definitely.
By it's not complicated to figure out why. Also, yeah, thing like stiffness of the plate. There's a lot of things that go into it. It gets very technical from an engineering standpoint, but like, we're always happy to talk about that stuff and to be completely transparent on that stuff.
Okay,
Jason, you are now sharing your screen.
Am I? I thought I was sharing
Yes.
yours. Oh, for goodness sake. I thought I was being clever then and fixing it.
No,
Sorry.
it should be on the participants panel. You should be able to right click on Ben Watson and right click and say make host.
Participants panel.
Okay, so that's a really good question.
Yeah.
Thinking about things like filtering is, I would encourage everybody to ask about that. How is the data filtered? Things about the electronics, that kind of stuff. Oh, nice. Now I'm the host again. All right, so I've set up this green screen. I don't know if anybody noticed that that's what's behind me, but that is a green screen. I could pull up some data just to kind of go through it really quickly. Take the accounting stuff off the screen.
And again, the good thing is that, of course, you can access this stuff and go back over it in your own time, can't they?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm just going to log in right now with our account, and I'll show some data. More or less where the filtering will come in is what I kind of want to show you. 1 second here. So somebody asked about force time curves and repeatability for individuals. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, should be able to see my screen here.
Yep.
This is a jump I did yesterday. Just from you can see our traces are pretty filtered. One thing to consider, not pretty filtered, I should say, pretty smooth. We don't need to do a ton of filtering. I have another test that was performed today. I think it should be in here. Chris may have gotten rid of it, or it's just earlier today, where he did a jump, or he did a couple of, oh, I guess it's not here. Not sure when these jumps were performed. He did some squats over a longer period of time. So your things like your x-axis are going to impact how much. Oh, that's a really good question from Milton. Things like the scale of your graph will impact the way that the data looks. If you're really zoomed in on a graph, it will look more. It will look a lot more noisy, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's noisy. One thing that I think is important to know is whether you can export the raw data from your system. So for example, if I export the raw data, I'm going to switch my sharing really quickly. And this is something I'll do a lot with portable plate that we have. It's actually behind me, behind my green screen. We collect data with that all the time, and we can export the raw data, and this is what the other metrics look like. So the moments, the FX, and the FY. It's a lot harder to standardize because it's going to be largely dependent on how the individual's moving their feet on the plate, how they're standing, where they're standing on the plate. All of that stuff comes into play. So we'd love to standardize some of that stuff, maybe to look at I don't know, variability or whatever, FX, FY for an individual, but we just don't have a lot of the standardized data for vertical jumps yet. So in terms of, if you're doing just vertical jump testing, do we think you need a 3D plate? Well, not necessarily, but the nice thing about 3D plates, and the reason that we work closely with Burtech and have integrated with a couple of AMTI plates, is that you can use the plates for a lot of other things, right? So you can do really nice balance work. You can do, you can plug it into your motion capture system, do 3D force vectors, things like that. So there are benefits to a 3D plate for sure. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them, but if you're purely interested in doing vertical jumps and maybe some isometric testing, single axis is typically going to be enough, but our system can easily handle both types of data. So that's important to note. I want to get
for vertical jumps, you're very rarely going to see more than a 5% contribution of horizontal force to a vertical jump. And the reason for this is if the contribution goes much more than 5%, i.e. the other 95% is purely vertical, then your jumper isn't going to land back on the force plate.
Nice.
And so that's kind of obvious to see if that makes sense without being too condescending, hopefully.
What are the best ways to train early stage RFD versus late stage? Good question. I do not have a good answer for that. Jason, do you have any thoughts on RFD in general?
Well, oh God, that's a slippery slope. I was actually just typing an answer to that particular question. I would
got
say,
it.
Yeah, ultimately, always strength is key. And then we can start thinking about, okay, when you've achieved a certain strength level, how can you improve your capacity to translate that strength into speed? So how can you apply it fast enough? So then you can start thinking about, okay, more ballistic kind of training, but pretty much for the early stage kind of stuff, you need to have that strength and then that ability to turn that muscle on. So some of the more advanced plyometric stuff can be really effective for that, but only as and when people have the capacity to actually deal with that.
Nice. I have another question here that is, okay, from Tommy. Thanks for your presentation. With the way force and time both impact, you should be able to see this all. If you're performing regular force plate testing, how do you recommend accounting for which factor has caused the increase in impulse? Well, if you just want to do a quick and dirty impulse estimation and you don't have, for example, you just have raw data, you know when the phases occur, like on a counter movement jump here, I gotta I have to modify because we're showing only a few things here. If I go in and I go to my counter movement jump and I just activate all the metrics and I go back to that jump, I can go in and I want to know what this area is. This green area that I'm looking at right here, this is the propulsive impulse. This is the factor which is going to determine how high I jump, or how high Chris jumps in this case. And it's not very high. I can say that confidently. And he's in the other room listening, so I know he's scowling. The average propulsive force, if I just look at his average propulsive force, is 1468. And then I look at his propulsive phase time, I can literally do quick multiplication and immediately get a rough estimate. It should be something around this it should be something around his propulsive impulse. Where is that?
The other way of doing that is to potentially take that takeoff velocity and just multiply it by his mass.
Okay, that's the much cheaper way to do it. Yeah, there's a few ways to get what that impulse is.
Yeah.
But to Tommy's question specifically, if you're curious about, hey, is it more force, or is it quicker, or is it the same force, less time, or more time? Including the phase time as one of your variables that you track and you monitor, as well as the average force during the phase. That's a really simple way that you can do that, just without doing any of the quick maths in your head.
So yeah, if that jump height goes up, or the takeoff velocity increases, or just the impulse increases, you just notice that. And the body, so if the body mass stays the same and their impulse increases, they will be jumping higher. So then all you need to do is look at the time. Has the phase duration increased or decreased? If it's decreased, then we know, we can be pretty confident that the force has increased, and vice versa.
Bingo. Couldn't have said it better myself, literally. So Tommy, I hope that made sense. We're happy to connect with you because you guys are a user. I could totally walk you through that, setting up your templates, but that's something we're looking to add to the system, so that instead of having to go in and change your metrics every time, currently I have to select what jump I'm modifying, etc., and then select or deselect any of the metrics. You can see we calculate 60 plus things. We don't recommend anybody try to look at 60 different variables for every single test they perform. It's just too much information. So one of the things that we are working on doing is building some templates out. Tell you the truth, it used to be in our system, but we took it out because of whatever reason. We're going to try to bring that back in the future, so that you can then say, like, hey, I just want to look at force and time, and boom, have a saved template that just shows the 4 or 5 things that you want to look at. Select a different template. And then the idea behind that is that when I go in and I want to do something like a trend report for an athlete, for example, and I say, okay, how's Ben doing on, the 2 key variables I like, they're all going to be then available. So a good example, this is always interesting to show. Actually, I can do it. There's a better way to do this. So if I go here and I say, Ben Watson, I want to look at jump height, and I also want to look at takeoff velocity, just to sort of reiterate, they trend exactly together. And the reason for that, takeoff velocity and jump height, is because we use takeoff velocity to calculate jump height. So, this can be useful looking at something like this to say, like, oh, wait, takeoff velocity and jump height are literally following one another perfectly.
But how? How can they do that, Ben?
Well, you might be surprised to know that one determines the other. So one thing that can be useful with these types of graphs and sort of charting things over time is determining what are, redundant metrics, right? Because a lot of the stuff in here is not, not to say it's not useful. It's just that, we look at it 4 different ways or whatever. Do we really need to look at all of them?
No, just because it's there doesn't mean to say you have to use it.
Yeah, and another thing
it comes
is,
down to ownership, right? Take responsibility for your data.
Yeah, and that is exactly why we have a number of different versions of the same things in the system, is because we want to give people the data in a way that is comfortable for them, right? So a way that makes sense to them. So Tommy, I hope that answered your question.
Can I just add one more point to that?
Of course.
Well, I'd say, can I? I'm going to. I wasn't. One of the other things to bear in mind is that we quite often get sidetracked by research that shows a relationship between a performance element and a particular metric, and that can be really, really useful. However, it's also important to note that things like impulse, for example, have a mechanical or a theoretical relationship. So they might not necessarily demonstrate a statistical relationship, although they often do, but the mechanical or theoretical relationship just can't be denied. It's Newton's laws, and they're laws for a reason. So impulse is going to be directly proportional to how high you can jump, unless your mass changes considerably. And there's just no way around that. And then you can start thinking about the strategy and the drivers behind that. That's how you get a better understanding of what your athletes can do.
Perfect. Jason, one thing I would add, just to kind of wrap things up, what are your thoughts on relative values? Because that's the trend we've seen more and more. And, you know, we do some of that stuff. So we'll give you something like average propulsive power. So that's average power produced over the propulsive phase, which is the shaded green in our system. We'll give you average propulsive power, but then we'll also give it to you as a relative value. So average relative propulsive power, what I see this a lot. People have asked us for this. Hey, we want to get, you know, impulse power, et cetera. We want to get it all relative to body mass in kilos. What are your thoughts on that, Jason?
I think it can be really useful, but again, it's only going to ever tell you part of your answer, really. Or it's only going to partly answer your question, should I say, because that's great unless the athlete's body mass has changed.
Right.
And it might be really good. You might be striving to reduce the athlete's or increase the athlete's body mass, in which case that change could be positive. However, if that relative power decreases or increases and you're not keeping track of their body mass as well, then how on earth are you going to understand what caused that?
Nice. Yeah, so the nice thing about force plates is that it's basically a scale, as mentioned.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you don't need to weigh your athletes as well if you're jumping them regularly.
No, you get their body weight from each. Yeah, you basically, with your force records that Ben's showing you here, you essentially have a record of their body mass on a day-by-day basis.
Exactly.
You don't necessarily need to scribble down how much they weighed on that particular day. You've got that data from your force plate testing.
Awesome. Yeah. So actually, just to highlight that, you know, this is an example of my jump I did last week. It's not, you know, not my best jump. It's not bad. Hands on hips, not too shabby. But what you'll notice is that if I just look at something like average propulsive force, so this is a 48 centimeter jump with hands on hips, I should mention, and I'm not an athlete anymore, so it's not bad. But if I look at my average propulsive force trend right now for the last 20 sessions, even the last 10 sessions, this jump is actually well below. And there's a very simple explanation for that, is that I have lost 15 pounds over the last 8 weeks or so. So I'm able to jump higher, I'm losing mass. So if I were just looking at average propulsive force as one of my key performance metrics, this would indicate that, hey, this one's well below my mean for this time, for this period, right? So for the last 60 days, my mean for average propulsive force, and again, I really don't like to have all the metrics active like this because it's so much information to look at. But if I look at my average propulsive force, it's right here, it's 2344. The mean, it's below the mean, right? So we're below the mean on this particular one. Oh, sorry, it's peak. Gosh, I was going to say that didn't look right. If I look at the average, I'm well below the mean for this period in time. You know, so this would be a bad jump if I were just looking at that one metric. However, I know that jump height is better, so something is improving. Again, the key that we're trying to reiterate and hammer home is that there is no one sort of, or there is no 2 or 3 or even 4 things. It really depends on what you're looking to achieve with your athletes, and to be open to adding or removing things as needed, right? As you go,
Absolutely.
as you learn more and as you absorb more information. Okay.
And you can see this system gives you a really easy way of doing that.
So Robert has another great question. So standardizing force time curves. So yeah, no, we don't have that yet. We've done some really cool stuff with that internally, but it's not part of the web app yet. I do like the idea of that because you can very quickly determine, you know, what percentage of the jump is braking versus unweighting over time, and if that's changing. That's a really interesting idea. I appreciate that question. We don't have that functionality yet, but we had a guy do some really cool stuff with R for us. Looking just at that, we have a really cool AI running right now, learning how to identify different jumps and whether they're good jumps, et cetera. And part of that is standardizing to a, you know, percentage. And yeah, it's doable. It's definitely something we'd like to add, but it's also one of those features that I think would get, maybe it wouldn't get used by enough of our users. Yeah, because we wouldn't be able to, I wouldn't be able to explain it well enough. So that's a really interesting idea though, just to look at like, hey, over the last 6 months, this is how this athlete's
Yeah.
Time curves have sort of morphed or changed during the progression in the training or something like that. That's really, really good
I
idea.
think it can give you a really useful visual, if an athlete's jump strategy changes, the visual impact that can give you can be quite intense, and that can be pretty cool because you can see it immediately that there's been a real change. However, we also know that we can sometimes often rely on it, and it doesn't necessarily tell us what we perhaps think it's telling us. So it can be important to bear that in mind as well, I think.
So the final thing I'm going to show. So if you look at RFD and you really dial into RFD and you say, I want to see the highest rate of force development, that's what I'm most interested in. This is an example of a jump. One of our team members did March of last year, almost exactly a year ago. That's total coincidence. The breaking rate of force development on this particular test is almost 40,000 newtons per second, which is obscene.
Yeah.
You just
What
don't
does
see.
that mean? No.
Yeah, and okay, if I were just looking at breaking RFD, I would say, wow, what an amazing jump. But we did this jump and we did a bunch of these to highlight the fact that that doesn't translate in this particular case. You only jump 20 centimeters. So if you know what you're trying to influence, if you know what you're trying to sort of score for a particular metric, it's pretty simple to just really move very rapidly through the unweighting and braking phases to achieve that really, really high RFD. But the end result is that it wasn't, he didn't get nearly big enough contraction to actually jump high or what he's capable of. And as a result, it's just a really high number, but it serves almost no value. And we have a bunch of them in here. I think this one is, okay, that's a really ugly one. But this is another example where it's 45 centimeters. Okay, that sounds good, or that is pretty good, but breaking RFD is 17,000. I mean, it's kind of a hideous, I don't really know what was happening here, something with my feet. But yeah, again, this shape looks nothing like most force time curves for counter movement jump, and yet, here it is. I'm not reading too much into it. It's just most likely a one-off. But yeah, I mean, I think we've probably covered most things. Again, apologies for any of the technical glitches. This is our first pass. However, like I said, next week, a little bit later in the day, we're going to be running basically a demo walkthrough. And what I want to do on that and what I'd like to achieve on that is really, I want to go through the testing process to talk about best practices, to talk about why we might do certain tests and how to best do them, and then do some live testing so that people can see. Because one thing that we found is some of these points are really easy to illustrate if you can actually do the movement yourself as a coach, as a researcher, whatever, as a practitioner, to say, okay, what does higher RFD look like? What does it feel like? I'm going to do an intentionally high RFD jump. What does that actually look like? That can really help hammer home some of these concepts if they're still kind of nebulous or not super clear. Yeah, thanks, Tommy. So yeah, that's going to be next week. We're going to be getting more webinars going with Dr. Lake. Hopefully Peter will be on here in the next couple of weeks, as well as some of our users. We're really trying to build out a robust program so that people can have a source for solid, transparent, and simple information to better understand the information that they're collecting from their athletes. Like I said previously, if you want to schedule a demo, a one-on-one walkthrough, always happy to do it. But the point of this is not just to sell force plates. That's, if that happens, again, we're not complaining, but we really want to provide this information as just a way to contribute and to give back, because strength conditioning community is so small, and we have so many great friends and people that we've worked with for the last couple of years that have really helped us build this company, and we want to be able to give back in any way that we can. So thanks to Jason for his presentation, and thanks to everybody who attended. This is going to be available for download. I'm going to probably edit some of the stuff, probably some Photoshop on myself to look a little more tan. But beyond that, maybe the lights were too bright. I'm not sure. I'll work on that for next week. But again, thank you to everybody who joined us today. It was a lot of fun, and you can see my dog walking around in the background. This is great. I really appreciate everybody who participated. And if you did not get your question answered, as Jason said, please reach out to us. We're happy to to get in the weeds on some of this stuff with you. We love it. This is what we do all day, every day. Obviously, Jason's actively teaching, so when he has time, but here at Talkin Dynamics, this is what we do all the time. So Thanks to everybody. We will be back next week, and keep an eye on our social media and all that stuff for links for next week's webinar, and hopefully we can do it every week. And if anybody wants to contribute to any of our content, we'd love to have you. Yeah, just let us know. Jason, anything to add?
Absolutely. No, just thank you. Great opportunity to actually share some educational resources. Perfect.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk soon.